Hey guys, my name's Aislinn. I'm a TA for 337, and tonight I'm going to be doing the online final exam review. So it's going to be a combination of questions that we received on the discussion board on my courses, as well as two questions that Dr. Weinberg didn't get to finish when she was doing the online or the review session in class, last class. So I'm going to start from start with some questions that we had in the discussion board. When I finish going through all the questions, if you have additional questions, just please comment in the chat box on YouTube. Okay. So the first question we had was about criteria for designating an empirically supported therapy. So one student asked, does a group design study have to be both A, superior to pill, placebo, a psychological placebo, or another treatment, and B, equivalent to an already established treatment? If so, why do you need to show your treatment is equivalent to another treatment if you've already shown it was superior? I understand that A might be referring to a control condition, but it's not clear to me why. If it's another treatment control, you still need to satisfy criteria B. So I put up a slide. This is from your textbook on page 465. And basically in this section, it says that one of two sets of studies are necessary. And so it's either a study like an RCT that's showing that your therapy is better than a pill, better than a placebo, or another empirically supported therapy, or it's as good as another therapy that already exists. And so it's one or the other, not necessarily both. And so this is just one set of criteria that are required for your therapy to be empirically supported. It could also be the case that you have a study or you have at least 10 single case design studies that demonstrate efficacy of a particular therapy. So I would suggest just looking over this little table on page 465, and it'll give you some more information. Okay. The next question was about how to calculate prevalence. So prevalence is equal to incidence rate times the average duration of disease or chronicity. So the question was, while I do understand the definition of prevalence and incidence, I don't really get this equation. How would you quantify chronicity? Why do you multiply as opposed to taking the sum of the number of new cases or incidents and the number of old cases, chronic cases? Can you please explain in an easy to understand way? Okay, I will try. So prevalence, as we know, is the proportion of a population that has a condition at a specific time. But the prevalence is going to be influenced both by the rate at which new cases are occurring, which is the incidence, and the average duration of the disease, which is chronicity. So you can also think of chronicity as the average time that people have the disease. So from the point that you're diagnosed until the person is either cured or they die. So let's say that we have an incidence rate of 10 for a year. That is 10 new cases a year, and the chronicity of the disease is 5 years. So people with the disease in year one, so there'll be 10 people with the disease in year one and 20 in year two, etc. So we multiply because the prevalence is a rate, and you're not able to sum new and old cases because chronicity does not represent actually old cases of a disorder. As I said, it represents the average time that people will have the disease. Okay. So the next question we got was about cyclothymia. So the student said that in the DSM-5, criterion C specifies that criteria for a major depressive, manic, or hypomanic episode have never been met. Yet Dr. Weinberg said that cyclothymia involves hypomania and short subthreshold depressive episodes. Did she mean subthreshold hypomanic symptoms? So yes, she did mean subthreshold hypomanic symptoms. So to get the diagnosis of cyclothymia, we know that for at least a 2-year period, there have been episodes of hypomanic and depressive experiences, which do not meet the full DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for hypomania or major depressive disorder. So for cyclothymia, you have to have hypomanic symptoms, but they're not necessarily enough symptoms to actually meet criteria for an episode of hypomania. The next question we got was about the lecture on PTSD. So Dr. Weinberg said that both PTSD and depression are associated with smaller hippocampal volumes. However, later when discussing the results of the Pittman et al. 2006 twin study of combat-exposed war veterans with PTSD, she said that the results suggest that a smaller hippocampal volume might be specific to PTSD, as unexposed co-twins weren't more likely to develop MDD, while their exposed co-twin with PTSD was more likely. Obviously, there are mixed findings, but was this info she gave on slide 13, that both disorders might share this, what I should consider to be the more widely accepted finding? So I think that's right. The last part that you say, like decreased hippocampal size is not specific for PTSD because it has found to be present in a variety of different psychiatric disorders. So like depression, as you said, as well as schizophrenia, and some evidence for it in people who have alcohol use disorder. And I think the results of the Pittman study just suggest that rather than being a consequence of a traumatic or stressful experience, reduced hippocampal volume may be sort of a vulnerability marker for developing stress-related disorders like PTSD. Okay, so one of the questions that Dr. Weinberg received that she didn't get to cover in lecture was this one. So would you be able to clarify the extent to which an individual being in distress over their own condition or state plays a role in the diagnosis of personality disorders in the DSM-5? So in the DSM-5, one criterion that's present for the diagnosis of all of the personality disorders is that the enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior leads to clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, and other important areas of functioning. So the individual being in distress is important for the diagnosis, but it's not necessary. So that is, the person may not be in significant distress. Let's say they have borderline personality disorder, for instance. They may not be distressed, but they're going to show impairments in other areas, like interpersonal functioning, for instance, which presumably, I can't think of many instances in which, like, if there were impairments in other areas of your life, it wouldn't cause distress. But it could be very well the case that this person's personality and behavior could hurt others more than distress that individual, in which case this would still be acceptable to make a diagnosis. So distress is important for the diagnosis, but it's not necessary. If there's impairments in other areas, then that's sufficient enough. Okay, and the last question that she didn't get to was about different types of studies. So clarifying the difference between cross-sectional, case control, and cohort studies. I don't understand the fundamental differences between them. So cross-sectional studies, as we talked about in class, there are many studies like this that study psychopathology. A limitation of these studies is you can't establish temporal, well, it's hard to establish temporal precedence. like for instance, if you were trying to understand whether an event preceded the onset of a disorder and whether those two things were associated, it's hard to necessarily establish whether an event necessarily led to maybe the onset of a disorder or the worsening of symptoms. And cross-sectional studies often will involve controlling for a third variable. So often these studies will use a control group. Usually these control groups are healthy individuals, and you include these people in your analyses. Case control studies, on the other hand, you're comparing one group of people with a disorder to a second group without the disorder, and then finally cohort, you have a single large sample of people, some of whom have the disorder. So I think one of the easiest ways to kind of understand the differences is to understand when these studies are used for different types of research questions. So, for example, cohort studies are often used to study incidence, causes, and prognosis because they measure events in chronological order, and they can be used to distinguish between cause and effect. However, cross-sectional studies are used more often to determine prevalence. They're relatively quick and easy, but they do not permit sort of distinguishing between cause and effect, as I alluded to earlier. And then case-controlled studies compare groups retrospectively. So they're seeking to sort of identify possible predictors of outcome and are useful for studying rare diseases or outcomes. And they are often used to generate hypotheses that can then be studied via like a prospective cohort study, for instance, some other design. That clears that up. Okay, so if you guys have any more questions, please just post them in the YouTube chat link, and I'll do my best to answer them. Chat link, and I'll do my best to Okay, guys, that's the end of the review. If you have remaining questions, Yulia will be holding a review session on Sunday at 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. So you can ask her a bunch of questions then. I hope you all have a good weekend and take lots of breaks, and good luck studying.